Let me join everyone in thanking our panel for joining us today. We have a distinguished panel. And the reason I wanted to put the panel together in the way we do is I wanted to have some practitioners, some academics, to mix and match among different perspectives on how we compare the BRI initiative, the FOIP initiative, and what is the goal is also an extraordinarily important part of the whole discussion. It's easy to talk about the competition between systems, but we shouldn't forget that we're trying to achieve something. Basically, I think one of the key things we're trying to achieve is peace in the region through prosperity. Okay? So are these two sort of competing visions really competing? Are they complementary? Are they big enough to solve the problem? These are issues that I think we all need to deal with in a more, call it, numerical way. Let me start with one observation. The Asian Development Bank, a couple years ago, published an estimate that the Asian nations would need, between 2016 and 2030, Asia would need about $26 trillion of infrastructure investment. Okay? Now, that's just infrastructure. There's some other things we're going to be needing. Education, healthcare, there's some climate change elements in this. The Asian Development Bank estimate included a little bit for climate change, about 3 of the 26 trillion. But this is a very large amount of money. So what I'd like to start with today is starting with Kashiwakura-san to talk about her perspective from the Gates Foundation on what are some of the non-infrastructure needs, health, education, things like that, particularly health, that are sort of unseen in this debate about what we're doing. And then we can move on to some of the economics and then some of the business elements. So, Kashiwakura-san, onegaishimasu.
Thank you, Robert. For those of you who don't know about the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation, we work in the least wealthy countries, primarily in global health. So 70% of our money goes into global health. And we're known for philanthropy, but we would like to emphasize that we're not just here for philanthropy. There is a strong economic case. So one of the articles that Bill Gates, our co-chair, has published earlier this year on the Wall Street Journal was him and Melinda Gates has invested $10 billion 18 years ago. So we compare that across global health, infrastructure, and the S&P equity index, as well as in energy projects. Well, we found out that the $10 billion that could have invested in the S&P 500 would have become $17 billion today if we factored in the reinvestments and dividends. The energy projects would become $150 billion. Infrastructure would become $170 billion. Now, global health, the $10 billion that we invested has an estimated amount of $200 billion in social and economic benefits. What this means is that often human capital is a forgotten element in economic sort of statistics. We see human capital as the economic engine of society. We know that 10 to 30% per capita GDP difference is attributable to how countries are making human capital investments. So if we increase human capital investments across sub-Saharan Africa, it could increase the size of the economy by nearly 90% by 2050. So this means today the $1,600 per capita in 2017 would grow to over $3,000 per capita in 2050. So that said, our work with China, India, the initiatives surrounding that is primarily to really enhance some of the issues that we see in sub-Saharan Africa today. When you look at the world today, the extreme poverty population, 56% resides in sub-Saharan Africa, while 54%, the remaining 54%, are in middle-income countries. So primarily, we see China and India as critical partners to advance human security, human capital across the world in the most needed regions. Is that my 5 minutes, maybe?
You have a little more if you want.
Okay, but maybe I'll end there.
Okay, thanks. Let me ask one question, which is, what is, in your view and your experience, the interaction of environment issues and health issues? I recently read an article about mosquitoes that was a little bit frightening.
Yes. So we do a lot of work in agricultural development because we know that climate change would heavily affect the poorest population of the world. Some of the works that we do from the foundation on climate change is how we prepare new crops to become much more climate change adaptable products.
Okay, thanks very much. I think this goes back to Danny Russell's point about common problems that both the BRI and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific need to address together. And so I think it's a very good starting point because we have common problems that we have to remember as we do all this. As we address those, let me move next to Sakuragawa Sensei. Let me ask you about the role of the public sector, both as investor, as regulator, as adjudicator. What are the roles of the public sector in these two visions, and what are the pluses and minuses for each vision?
Okay, thank you very much. I am Masaya Sakuragawa. I am an economist, so that I want to talk about the global framework of global economy in the next 30 years. So in 50, so maybe some report says that Asians, GDP, Asia includes India, South Asia and Southeast Asia is over 50%, which means that the Western share is declining, which means that assets and GDP shift from West to Asia. Our concern is that if Asia take our leadership in the next 30 years, particularly in economy, politics, military affairs, and technology and culture. That question. That depends on China, not Japan, unluckily. Because Japan has a global eye, but China has a global eye. Also that is skewed. Now, that kind of argument is, now we talk in terms of the hegemon competition. Now, China and the US are competing in hegemon. Hegemon take several dimensions. Our first one is about trade and investment. In trade hegemon, now Trump and Xi Jinping are a very serious battle. Now we know from everyday television news, right? Trade war. About investment. Now this current issue is related. That is a battle between BRI and FOIP. Which will win this competition is now an important question. So my view is that now China has a good position relative to US and Japan because China has abundant saving. That abundant saving is channeled to Asian area that create a lot of infrastructure investment. Actually, China, do you know China's saving rate? For example, my hint is Japan. Japan's saving rate is about 25%. US saving rate is 15%. Lowest in the advanced countries. China's saving rate is over 50%. Very crazy. That never happened in market economy. And that comes from communistic society. On the other hand, Japan and US can supply money into Asian area is questionable. As you know, Japan is a very bad situation for fiscal deficit. Japan's public debt is over 20% of GDP, and that is the worst in the world. We have no money. In US, situation is very similar. US has increasing government budget deficit, and so no room for increasing money. But the chance is coming. That chance comes from global low interest rate. Now the world interest rate is historically very, very low. In what sense interest rate is low? Particularly government yield interest rate is low relative to economic growth rate. That is a very historical event, which means that thanks to low interest rate, so strong U.S. dollar, U.S. government can raise money from the world with a very low cost. That is a possibility to continue FOIP. A second area for hegemon is about technology. Now China is competing with the US in the new technology, including telecommunication and AI. Third hegemon area is about currency. I think this is the most important point, and that is the final stage of competition between US and China. That may be very interesting. So what will happen if China takes hegemon? Is that heaven or nightmare? Maybe if China takes hegemon, so in the world, democracy is restricted. No free trade. Maybe free trade is distorted. And exchange rate system is very opaque and transparent. Everywhere there are a lot of state-owned enterprises. Do you like that world? But so there are several weak points of China. One point is that China style is very isolated Chinese sort of style, not compatible with Western style nor Japanese style. That style respects democracy, human rights, freedom, and market system. But China's system is different. They don't respect democracy, as you know in the case of Hong Kong problem. And their economic system is different from market-based system. The system is called state capitalism. And then don't keep the international rules. So that China cannot receive any support of other small nations, which means that if China become a hegemon, China needs to get support from other small nations. Because hegemon, China wanted to supply hegemon, but if China be a hegemon, that need demander of hegemon, which means the support of a small nation, such as ASEAN countries and other Asia, Eurasian countries, and Japan. The second weak point is about currency problem. Do you imagine a world of Chinese yen is so used everywhere instead of US dollar? In order to create that world, China has to overcome several problems. Now, China is growing up thanks to the US dollar system. US dollar is dominant, so that Chinese yen is very weak, and US dollar is very strong. So that export is increasing. So China realized export-based economic growth. China's success was thanks to US system. US supplied international public goods to China. China is an exploiter. If China wants to take a hegemon, China's stage rank up to the position of providing international public good to the world. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks very much. You mentioned technology at one point, so that's a perfect way to ask Winston, since you're engaged very closely in the technology side of this. Let me ask you, how do you view the development of technology, the BRI versus FOIP element of it, but also how do you see the labor market changing as a result of technology? When I look at the maps of the FOIP system or the BRI system, both sides have their little maps of who's going to do what to where. I noticed there's a very interesting difference, which is the BRI map that I see mostly connects Asia to Eastern Europe and the Middle East. The FOIP map also includes Africa. Okay, so how do you see the role of connectivity as per your new book? How do you see the role of technology in creating both competition and cooperation among the regions? And what rules do we need to make this work best?
Wow, that's great.
5 minutes.
Yeah, 5 minutes, right? Yeah. Again, thanks very much for having me here. We're talking about competing vision, right? Last 10 years, I work at CIC, China's sovereign wealth fund, and before that, 10 years was Wall Street lawyer and a banker in New York. Right, I'm Chinese native, but now I'm living in Trump Tower in Jersey City. So talking about competing vision, I'm living through it. Right? So, but really good to have me here because besides the Asia Society, my new book on China's data/digital economy in Japanese version will be published by Hayakawa Publishing House this year. So I'm very glad to get more and more involved with Japan market as well as the broader discussion. So very quickly, since talking about geographic feature of the Belt and Road, so just to have this background, right? The belt was meant to be this Eurasia economic belt, which starts from China, gets into Kazakhstan, gets into Central Asia, Eastern Asia, Europe, the 16+1 you mentioned, and all the way to I think theoretically Rome. That's where Marco Polo started. But I think it's also today it's also got extended to Spain and UK, those kind of areas as well. And the road actually is a maritime road. It's called Maritime Silk Road. Starts from China to Southeast Asia, and since and through Suez Canal into Mediterranean, right? So, but why the African connection? That's because before the Suez Canal is there, right? Well, for ships to get into Mediterranean, they have to go to Southeast Asia all the way to Africa, cross at the Good Hope, and then go back up, and then all the way through Africa and then back to Mediterranean, right? So, so I think when you think about Belt Road, certainly. It should cover the 3 continents because Africa is going to be this fastest growing continent in terms of economic growth as well as population growth, right? So when you think about the infrastructure network to connect the future market, then certainly Africa is going to be a very big part of it, right? And then the Eastern Asia, Central Asia, so on and so forth. Now, why the digital, the technology piece is so important to this? I think for three very important reasons. Number one, actually precisely because it's digital, it's in the cyberspace, then it's not limited by geography, right? You do not have to be physically next to each other or the historical background, but all you need is this connectivity in the cyberspace, right? And whether you're in Latin America, or whether you're in, let's say the Nordic countries, right? You can be connected to this global digital economy through the Silk Road in cyberspace. So that's one. Number two, I think because the digital economy is the ongoing and the future growth engine of the world economy. Then this connectivity is about the sustainability of the future economy, right? So, and the third part is when we think about digital, actually the gap you mentioned becomes even bigger, right? Because the number you mentioned about the need of infrastructure and the actual infrastructure gap is based on the traditional economy, right? For the digital aspect, the gap may be even bigger because certainly you would have the typical physical infrastructure as well, the towers, the networks, right? Just like the roads and the ports, right? But if you think about it, you still have another level of the infrastructure, which is the spread of the smartphones, the smart devices, mobile devices, right? And in China, China has the benefit of manufacturing in China's expertise. So the China market created lots of local brands, cheaper price, high quality, so that hundreds of millions of people get smart devices very quickly. But many parts of the world may not have that luxury, right? So they have to get to the spread of mobile devices as part of the infrastructure. And then earlier you mentioned about the education, that you would say for all the people to be relevant for the digital economy, you have to provide the digital education, right, to the people who just start to become internet user, to make the next step to become an internet player, right? They need this digital education, digital literacy to be a player in the future digital economy, right? So this is a segue into your final point about the jobs, right? If we don't put in these infrastructures, the three levels, the basic internet connectivities, the spread of mobile devices, and then the digital literacy education, right? Certainly a lot of people will not be relevant to the digital economy. So even before the machines taking over, they're already out of the game, right?
Okay. Let me ask you one other thing. There's been a lot of debate about, in the U.S., GAFA, the big monopolist. In China, I think it's called BATH for, Baidu, Tencent, et cetera. Will this this expansion of digital technology create so much monopoly power that growth is actually constrained?
Yes. I think the general answer is yes. The general answer is. And in China, you can see that, right? On one side, if there's a good idea, the big platforms has the same kind of team, and they have more capital, and they have more existing traffic users. So any good idea they can take and play out more quickly, more powerfully, right? So that is a hit on the new innovations, and you see that in the U.S. as well. So for example, advertisement, right? E-commerce, let's say the mobile business advertisement, right? Essentially more than 90% of the advertisement dollar will go to Facebook and Google, right? So that's a very big hit on innovation. And then another kind of proof of that is when you in the VC world, when you talk to the companies, when you say, what's your exit strategy? Right? 9 out of 10 will say, I will sell myself to Tencent,
right?
Or I sell myself to Alibaba, right? So you can see this. You can see this tension there, and this is actually the year, right? Both China and the U.S. are taking steps on regulating the large platforms. Actually, that includes Japan as well. I think the new law to regulate major platforms has been submitted to the parliament, right? So I think this 2019 actually will be a big year for regulating these major platforms, right? But the bigger issues, I think you alluded to at the beginning, was about how to reconcile the different philosophies across these different jurisdictions, different countries, when we enter into the digital economy in the global context.
Yeah. Actually, at one of the Asia Society breakfast meetings a couple weeks ago, we had a presenter, and he told us that in evaluating some of these models, the digital platform models, you have to look at the share that the platform takes between the two transaction sides, the seller, the shop, and the person. I bought, I have it here, yeah, this little glasses case the other day from Amazon. I wanted this particular kind, can't find it in any store. I go to Amazon, and they send it to me. I pay a little bit of fare, but of transport costs, but it was $10. Turns out that Amazon takes $2.50 out of that, 25% margin. Wow, that's a good business. Okay? So there's a question there about whether this digital structure leads to gouging. Right. Okay? And so we'll have to look at that and see who has the better regulation over that in the so-called market economy, which hasn't done a great job of it, or the state capitalism. Okay, let me move on to Heather and ask you about what's called the financing process and financial system stability. If we're really going to have 26 trillion, or maybe double that if you include the health and the internet stuff, or the IT stuff, if we're going to have 26, maybe $50 trillion of intermediation, final investment, how will we make sure that our financial systems are stable and don't go belly up the way they did in 2008?
Well, I think one answer I saw when is in the report that Secretary Russell was talking about, and their advice is to seek blended financing, which is a good idea. There are several reasons to be concerned about the issue you raise. I think that we have reason to be concerned that perhaps Chinese banks don't yet have the expertise or perhaps competency to evaluate projects totally based on returns, although there may be very high returns to be made in development. And then some of the lenders that are doing huge amounts of the lending are policy banks whose objectives are really political rather than evaluating projects based on their returns, taking into account political and economic risks. And this is the reason that, who called this debt trap diplomacy? Perhaps it was Vice President Pence, I'm not sure. This is what leads to these kind of concerns, that we have already poor and very indebted countries taking on even more debt. And is this debt trap diplomacy? And I recognize the concerns there. I want to point out, sort of play devil's advocate and point out a counter argument, which is that, some research on this is emerging. And, so some groups, probably a lot of you have seen the Center for Global Development that's raised concern about more than 20 countries that are getting to dangerous levels of debt. But on the other hand, there's some research coming out of, and I believe it's Johns Hopkins University, that shows that we all know, not we all, but a lot of us have heard of this infamous case in Sri Lanka about the port that was financed and then abandoned. Is it motivated by military? Other than that rather infamous case, it seems that a lot of debt has been renegotiated and in some cases canceled. So there are signs that perhaps this is, maybe a different ideological approach to development and maybe has some contribution to be made. And I wanted to maybe touch on it. I didn't realize it was so acknowledged, but it's come up twice about the internationalization of the yuan. And I just wanted to say a little bit about that as well. This has been, first the Europeans with the euro, and then I think when I was at the Asian Development Bank, at least, this was a big item on the agenda for Japan, internationalization of the yen. And neither of those have been perhaps successful in the way those regions had hoped. Some panelists seem a little skeptical about internationalization of the yuan, but I think that is something that is probably behind this BRI. And it seems that the current U.S. administration is unhappy about that, but I wonder if it's mostly for symbolic reasons, because while there are supposedly some benefits to the U.S. being the international currency and the main reserve currency, they're not that great. The main one is maybe the U.S. companies get lower borrowing costs, and research shows they're not actually that much lower, and we've been talking about how we're in an unusually globally depressed interest rate environment, so I think it's questionable about whether they are getting any benefit from that now. And the U.S. has certainly benefited, as perhaps it was Professor Sakuragawa who mentioned it, has benefited. So you made the point that China has benefited from the strong dollar and the weak yuan. Definitely true. The U.S. has been able to borrow, in a sense, from the future and run huge current account imbalances because of, what I think it was Ben Bernanke called capital inflows, the global savings glut. But this is not all positive for the U.S. So I think there could be something positive for the U.S. and also from the rest of Asia about having, to use the words of the Secretary earlier, not to have just one game in town, but to have some different options that give us a little bit of a different ideological perspective.
Thanks. One of the most interesting things, since you mentioned current accounts, one of the most interesting charts I've seen for the last year was from my colleague Robin Sheng in Hong Kong. And it was a chart of China's current account surplus as a share of GDP. Okay? 10 years ago, it was about 10%. Huge. Now, I remember having a conversation with Larry Summers here in Tokyo about, was it 1992, 93? We were talking about the Japanese current account surplus. And I said to him, Larry, how much is too much? And he said, well, I don't know, but 3 is too much. Okay? Well, China had 10. What is China's current account surplus today? 0. It's gone. And in fact, if the IMF's forecasts, if our own forecasts are true, that Chinese current account surplus will now go negative. Okay? So if it goes negative, that means China's going to have to start borrowing from the rest of the world to fund even its own development. This is very interesting. Okay? What will happen to exchange rates and interest rates in a world where both the United States and China are running current account deficits? Somebody's going to have to save, and that's going to come either through exchange rate adjustments, interest rate adjustments, or GDP adjustments, and it's not going to look very pretty. So I think another element in this BRI versus FOIP sort of competition is whether we can get our countries to have a stronger growth platform so that we can generate the money necessary for other countries so that we can invest in other countries. On that point, I'd like to ask Professor Sakuragawa also about the relationship in both China and the United States, also Japan, between the Social Security system and its prospects and the ability of the countries to maintain their growth paths and to fund other countries. More specifically, will the Social Security problems prevent either country from realizing the BRI or the FOIP? Please.
Social system program is a big issue. So in all the advanced economy, and particularly so in Japan. Mm-hmm. Now maybe situation, lot of calculations going on about how Japan's debt is sustainable or not. So accidentally I calculated yesterday, so some number. So which means that the sustainability depends on how is interest rate going up. Now the current situation is interest is very low. This situation is continue in the future. Japan may be sustainable. The situation may be the same also to US. And so in China, there is no social security system. This is a future challenge that may have a great impact on the global economy. That's all.
Okay, thanks. Yes, thanks.
Yeah, I add a little to this because when you think about China's using US dollar to go abroad making investments, right? That's what I used to work when I was at the CIC. Actually, that US dollar is not part of the kind of social welfare. I think that it's a very important point, right? Because even though the US dollars that used for investment is called as a sovereign wealth fund, but in reality it is not kind of the sovereign wealth in the similar context like the oil countries like Norwegian or the Middle East, right? That's because of the bifurcation of the currency, right? So if you look at the Chinese balance sheet, for the current $3 trillion foreign reserve, actually it's the mirror image of the Chinese economy. It's not the dollars from the social welfare, right? Because for 30, 40 years, right, China had a huge trade surplus, as you mentioned. So if we think about, let's say, a shoe factory in Shenzhen, right? So they're selling shoes, they're producing Nike shoes and sell to the U.S. market. Then there's a trade surplus, they got U.S. dollars, but according to Chinese law and also practically, the renminbi is the currency, right? So they have to submit the U.S. dollars to the central bank, right? Local bank all the way to the central bank, and this thing got accumulated. And also, like if Microsoft sets up a company in China, they bring U.S. dollars in, but in order to pay the local employees, they convert the dollar into renminbi, and the U.S. dollar also goes all the way to the central bank, right? And then you can even say, some Chinese companies, they raise debt overseas, Hong Kong dollar debt or U.S. dollar debt, and then in order to expand their companies, they still have to convert those money into Chinese currency, and the U.S. dollar goes all the way to the central, right? Eventually, that gave me my job last 10 years, right? To invest the U.S. dollars. But if you think about that, right, that U.S. dollars is like a booking. They're like a booking on the country's balance sheet. It's kind of the image, the mirror image of the local economy, because if Microsoft decides to close down the factory and move back to Seattle, they sell the business, got a bunch of renminbi, and if they're lucky, they got permission, they convert the renminbi into US dollar, they bring back to Seattle, and the balance sheet US dollar number will come down, right? So actually, the social welfare part is a separate issue. Right now, when you think about the linkage between the foreign reserve and the overseas expansion, it's very direct. It's not really linked to domestic savings, right? So like now China has $3 trillion. How will the country do with it, right? And right now the feeling is for BRI, the Eurasia infrastructure network is a good hedge, right, for China's economy.
Yeah, as long as the rates of return are high, or high enough. Which brings up the question of the microeconomics of this 26 trillion or 50 trillion. What are the elements that would get private sector money involved? For example, you just mentioned China's reserves. I think it's about $3.5 trillion reserves right now. If they use all of them for this Asian infrastructure, well, that's a couple years worth, but it's not enough. We need private sector money. How do deals have to be structured to get the private sector to be interested in sort of coming along with public sector money? Maybe Kashiwakura-san, can you help us on that? Because I think some of what Gates Foundation does have, call it co-investment.
I can just say that we do a lot of manufacturing capacity building on vaccines. So, see, for example, in India, we work closely with the Indian government and also the private sector on building the vaccine industry there. And today, India has a supply of about 70% of low and middle income countries' vaccine comes from India. Likewise, China is also making huge investments in Africa. And in 2018, they just made a $60 billion renewal commitment to Africa. And we see a lot of opportunities of how we can really work closely with the private sector as well as the government. They've also recently created something not same as JICA, but they do have a new China International Development Cooperation Agency. And within that, it's not just about infrastructure. They're really looking into global health and R&D. We do have a lot of work that's ongoing with vaccine and R&D manufacturing industry, just to really look how China is a new market. Can they provide WHO pre-qualified vaccines, or can they become also a market of what we see in China, in Japan or Europe?
Do the private sector partners make money?
Of course they do.
Okay. Their returns are good enough.
So that's a very interesting question. So say for example, in Japan, what we've done with the Japanese pharmaceutical industry, we've created something called GHIT, the Global Health Innovative Technology Fund. The Japanese government, a number of Japanese pharmaceutical industries and the foundation puts together money to R&D for malaria, neglected tropical disease, some of the global health issues that usually do not make returns. So it's an interesting platform where we're trying to bring in capital to risk some of the long-term hedge. We're in the new phase of how we're trying to outroll our access and delivery, because in the next phase, yes, there are some pharmaceutical that does make benefits, and some of them continue to do donations. And so we're constantly looking into blended financing models or new types of innovative financing on making a more sustainable platform for our pharmaceutical partners.
Okay, thanks very much. Yes, Winston? Yeah.
Add on to this, because, thank you. No, because the number scale is really interesting. You say China's foreign reserve, that's a huge number, but it's quote unquote only 3 trillion, right? That's really interesting, because it may be shocking to people who's not in the capital markets, but Robert, you're from Morgan Stanley, so you will know 3 trillion in the global capital markets is still a very small number. So last week in New York, right, I was part of this CFA ESG summit, which involves all the many major kind of asset owners, which includes sovereign wealth funds representatives. I was there, and the Japan, Mizuho-san from the GPIF was there too. But they also have lots of institutional investors. If you think about like CSE was like you could close to 1 trillion maybe. GPIF is 1.5 trillion, right? But the fact is, the whole conference had 47 trillion assets represented, which means there's a lot of private institutions, such as BlackRock, such as some of the asset management firms that everyday people do not even deal with them. But when they put it together, actually, it's a huge amount of capital out there. So when we think about the global infrastructure gap, right, actually, it's really important, Robert, you comment on the point about this public-private connection, right? Because the sovereign funds have a lot of capital for sure, but there's the private institutions actually that do have lots of power as well. And the main discussion at the ESG summit, of course, infrastructure is important part of it, is the data issue, and it has 2 parts to that. One is for impact, for ESG considerations, how do you use quantitative measures to measure it, right? So that have the data on the impact. And the flip side is, as we talk more about the future digital economy, that means lots of the ESG investments would have this digital aspect. And when these investments, let's say healthcare infrastructure, let's say genomic medicine research, right? They all involve very interesting data in a very sensitive way. And then all of a sudden, you need a new global standard for the data governance, right? So these are 2 very interesting aspects of the data issue as we think about the future infrastructure.
Okay, thanks. Before we, Heather, did you have something? Okay. Before we open up for Q&A, which I'll do in a minute, you mentioned some big data things. If you want to see the future, there's a good place to see it in Okinawa, which is the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology. The head of the institute was here at the Asia Society just a couple weeks ago, and he gave a wonderful presentation. But this is an institute founded with Japanese government money that had the provision that more than half of the staff would be foreign. And they have this amazing group of scientists who are assigned laboratories on a random basis, so they'll talk with each other. And one of the things that has just come out of this institute is a new type of a solar cell, a perovskite solar cell of much higher efficiency than anyone's heretofore, cheap to make, This is the kind of free and open exchange of ideas, whether it's, I don't want to color it with any kind of politics, because the group that put this together had Japanese, Chinese, and people from other countries all working together on a common problem. That's the kind of future that I think that we need to see in order to solve some of these common problems. So that's the future of Asia. Let me stop there and open things up for Q&A. Questions? Danny, you're smiling. Yes. Oops. Oh, there's a microphone coming here. Thanks.
Thanks. My name is Duncan Clark. I was just picking up on the hegemony of the Chinese UN idea for the future. I think, Professor, you talked about that, and you touched on it also in terms of the limitations. But what about the U.S. control of the global financial architecture that we've seen playing out in the Iran situation also, which is linked to Huawei and so on, and the sense that China, itself is not even close to having that level of influence? And what are the competing visions there, particularly if we now have this idea of decoupling the capital markets, which is coming out of Washington talk about decoupling China from the U.S. capital markets? What unintended consequences might we see there?
Basically, so decoupling in the financial market is very difficult by definition. So actually, in case of China, China's financial market is less developed, as you know, immature. But why China is growing that? So that China didn't borrow money from foreign country. That is quite different. U.S. has a very deep and so sound, liquid financial market, so that U.S. can raise money from world. That is a big difference. But as Robert says that recently China's current account position is changing. I was very surprised that now the current is almost zero, which means that China's increasing pace of wealth is declining. A country of China with a low developed financial market can grow only with domestic saving. So that kind of weakness is coming, which maybe changes our situation in the future, I think.
Winston, do you have a comment?
Yes, very, very quickly. Right? Yeah. I think the digital currency actually may become a new wild thing, right? That may sort of emerge as a new form of currency in a decoupled block, right? That's quite possible. For example, Abu Dhabi, you see UAE try to make Abu Dhabi the center of crypto asset exchange, which they are working on it. So, and I think Saudi probably has some similar vision. So we'll see some emergence from that direction.
Mm-hmm. I wrote a paper on the issue a few years ago, and I think my conclusion, if I remember it, is to be the international reserve currency, you need a few conditions. One of them is a legal system that people trust. Second, you need open and deep capital markets. And the euro didn't quite make it. The renminbi hasn't made it. The yen hasn't quite made it yet. So in a way, it's kind of default for the dollar. And the question is, can the United States maintain that? Or is it, what do they call it, dongori no seikurabe? I think that's the term for it. What is it, acorns trying to fight over who's the tallest. So anyway, so next question. Now somebody be brave. Yes, if you would, thanks.
A little bit related to the last question. So I've been living and working in Japan, without a return ticket, so to speak, for about 20 years now, and started at the Asian Development Bank Institute, but I'm now at International Christian University. So spending a lot of my time teaching young people from different countries in Asia, and also the US and Europe and all over the world, really. And here's one thing that surprises me when I teach international finance, is that what the US calls the global not the global financial crisis, what Americans call the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s is called the IMF crisis in a lot of Asian countries. So I think this is an unspoken thing that perhaps a lot of people recognize, but I wanted to say it out loud, is that I think the one big ideological difference that China offers that's different from the Washington consensus is not looking down from moral superiority and not issuing strict conditions. Now, of course, as an economist, I recognize the benefits of free and open trade and rule of law and regulated capital markets. I'm not saying those aren't important, but I think Asia really badly wants an alternative that is more accepting of different kind of values, and that might be one role that BRI can play.
I would actually sort of counter that in one way, which is saying what worries me when I look at the Chinese and the US economies is not what's different about them, the state capitalism versus the market capitalism. What worries me is the similarities. We used to have this big debate about Japan as the state capitalist, America as, it was Japan Inc. versus America Inc. Okay? In one case, the state ruled business. The other was the business ruled the state. And I think in both China and the United States now, we have an interaction of those two sectors that creates a lot of monopoly power. And that can't be good for the allocation of capital. Winston, you wanted to comment on that?
Yes, because really into this, right, talking about the different values, that I want to emphasize that Japan may play a very important role in this, in particular in the digital governance context, especially with the Osaka track that Abe-san started right at the G20 Osaka. Then, I think you talk about different values. Yes, right. There's philosophical difference relating to the concept of data privacy, data security, so on and so forth. And I would even go a little further. So it's not just between China and the U.S., right? Because when you think about India, when you think about the Brazil, you think about other blocks of the world, they all have different kind of concepts of data because this is a new concept, still emerging, right? And the flip side is, you're also right, the similarities, right? Because for China and the U.S., during the mobile internet age, right, China had a lot of catch up, copied a lot of models from the U.S., but eventually developed its own champions of technology, right? So essentially, you're precise, right? they established very similar platforms, and now they have very similar monopoly power. It's almost like a global issue now. But more importantly, when they are dealing with similar issues, clearly there will be more conflicts, more direct competition, right? That's where all these tensions are emerging. So therefore, it's really interesting to see that Japan may play a very important role in this. This concept, DFFT, right? Data free flow with trust, that started by Abe-san at the G20 Osaka discussion. And, it may sound super ambitious, right? Because right now the global tensions on the data economy is just incredible. But just to start this global dialogue, out of Japan is a huge thing. At the G20, when Abe-san announced it, right, he was sitting in between President Xi on one side and Trump on his side. So when you can sort of have this figure in your head, right? It's not an easy picture, right? But to get that conversation started is super important, and that's why the G20 Osaka flag, right? It says Osaka de Sekai no Mirai o Tsukuru, right? It's it's almost like in Japan, we are making the world's future, right? So it's really important to think about Japan to play a very active and important role to reconcile this competition and contention.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a lovely sentiment. We have to end our session now, so thank you for ending it on such a lovely sentiment. And I think I turn things over to Glenn now for the next panel. Thank you very much.